The storm was relentless. The kind of storm that made the wind scream through the trees and the rain fall in sheets, blurring everything in sight. Thunder cracked like a whip, shaking the very earth. Emergency lights from police cars and fire trucks painted the wet streets in alternating flashes of red and blue, making everything feel surreal. Officer David Parker's flashlight sliced through the chaos at Miller's Creek, where a crowd had already gathered despite the ferocious downpour. The desperate cries of a mother echoed through the storm, mingling with the howling winds. The child. Someone save the child. 6-year-old Tommy Williams had been swept away by the fast-moving waters of the creek, his tiny hand barely visible above the churning current. In the midst of the panic, a blur of black and tan shot past the police barricade. Jack, the Thompson family's German shepherd, who had been missing for weeks, plunged into the violent water without a second thought. In the few seconds that felt like eternity, Jack fought the current with every muscle, emerging from the water moments later with Tommy's collar gently gripped in his mouth, dragging the unconscious child to safety. But in the frenzy that followed, paramedics working frantically to revive Tommy, the Williams family in hysterics, and the gathering crowd, it was easy to miss Jack's disappearance. The storm had swept him away again, this time not as a family pet, but as a hero lost to the wind and the rain. The only one who noticed Jack's vanishing was Emily Thompson, standing at her window miles away, unaware that her loyal companion had just saved a life before vanishing into the night. But the next morning, the headlines told a very different story. Vicious dog attacks child, local family's pet on the loose. The headline was accompanied by a grainy, unflattering photo of Jack taken months ago. Sarah Williams, Tommy's mother and a newly elected city council member, wasted no time casting Jack as the villain. "That beast dragged my son into the creek," she declared on the local news, her voice shaking with manufactured fear. "We've warned the Thompsons about their dangerous dog before. Now, look what's happened." The truth, that Tommy had been playing near the creek against his mother's warnings, remained buried beneath the tidal wave of accusations. The community, already on edge from a previous pit bull attack 3 years earlier, was quick to rally against Jack. Social media exploded with demands for action, and old reports of dog attacks resurfaced. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of controversy that was about to flood Maple Street. Emily couldn't comprehend what was happening. The dog she loved, the dog who had been her protector, her best friend, was being painted as a monster. At school, her desk was vandalized with crude drawings of snarling dogs. Former friends avoided her, and even her teacher's smile seemed forced. That evening, Emily sat by her window, staring out at the relentless rain. Her parents' voices grew louder from downstairs, the arguments growing more bitter. "I can't live like this," Robert, her mother, Catherine, declared. The phone calls, the threats, Emily crying herself to sleep, all because you insisted on keeping that dog. "Please, no," her father, Robert, pleaded. "I'm not going to let them take him down for something he didn't do." But as the rain continued to fall, the cracks in their family deepened. The fight had only just begun, and the world outside had already turned its back on the Thompsons, just as the community had turned on Jack. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when their world felt perfect, when Jack was the heart of the Thompson family. Robert and Catherine had adopted him when he was just a puppy, and from the moment he bounded into their lives, he became more than just a pet. He was their daughter's guardian angel. Every morning, Jack would wait by the back door, his tail wagging with boundless energy, eager to begin his day. Emily, even at 4 years old, would always find comfort in his presence. If she had a nightmare, Jack would appear, quietly sitting by her side, offering her the comfort she needed without a word. By 6, their bond had become unbreakable. He was there for every milestone, every laugh, every tear. The Thompson family's backyard was their sanctuary, where Jack orchestrated games of hide and seek and would never let Emily out of his sight. Even when they went to the park, Jack knew exactly where to stand, protectively between Emily and any perceived threat, but always gentle, even when neighborhood children petted him. Neighbors often marveled at how perfect Jack was. Dr. Anderson, their veterinarian, would remark that in all his years of practice, he had never seen such a perfect balance of protectiveness and gentleness in a German Shepherd. Jack was more than a dog. He was part of the family's fabric, holding them together in ways they could never have imagined. But all that changed in the wake of that storm. A community that once saw Jack as a guardian angel now saw him as a threat. The media sensationalized the story, painting Jack as a ticking time bomb, and the Thompsons found themselves on the defensive. Emily, who had always been proud of her bond with Jack, was now forced to question the very nature of the world around her. Was her dog truly dangerous? Could it be that everyone was right? Was Jack to blame? The storm didn't just change Jack's life. It began to unravel the fabric of their family. Emily found herself alone, watching as her parents grew more distant from one another, and the love that had once held them together now seemed like a distant memory. Jack was gone, and with him, everything that had made their lives feel whole. But deep down, Emily knew something the world didn't. Jack had saved Tommy. Jack wasn't the villain. He was the hero. But it would take a lot more than just her belief in him to bring the truth to light. The storm had passed, but the damage it left in its wake was far from over. As the days wore on, the Thompsons' lives were increasingly consumed by the battle to clear Jack's name. Robert Thompson, once a respected defense attorney in Maple Creek, found himself in uncharted territory, fighting for the truth, not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Social media had become the battleground. News outlets, eager to stoke the fire of sensationalism, played on the fears of a community that had already suffered one traumatic attack. The images of Jack, his dark eyes staring out from the headlines, were used to perpetuate the narrative of a dangerous, wild animal. Headlines screamed, "Family dog turns vicious," and online petitions for Jack's capture and euthanasia spread like wildfire. The digital world, once a place for community connection, had turned into a place of fear and judgment. A Facebook group dedicated to Maple Street was flooded with warnings about dangerous breeds, with Jack's image plastered across every post. The group, once a place of neighborhood updates, had become a toxic space, a breeding ground for fear-mongering, and Sarah Williams had capitalized on it. Emily felt like she was losing her mind. Every day, she saw the world she once knew crumble. Her friends at school, who had once looked up to her, now avoided her. The whispers behind her back, the cruel taunts written in chalk on her locker, "Monsters girl," they all gnawed at her soul. At home, the atmosphere was just as strained. Her parents fought constantly, their arguments often turning into bitter, whispered exchanges when Emily was within earshot. She heard the faint sound of her parents' voices rising in the kitchen below. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were on the brink of falling apart. The next morning, as Robert walked out the door to his office, he gave Emily a quick kiss on the forehead. "I'll be back soon, kiddo," he said, his voice tight with the strain of everything they were going through. But his footsteps sounded heavy as they faded away down the hallway. Emily sat at the window again, staring out at the empty backyard, remembering Jack's comforting presence. She could still see him in the corner of her mind, his protective gaze, his gentle nature that had made him her best friend. He had always known when she needed him. But now Jack was gone, and with him, it felt like a part of her had been torn away. But Emily wasn't the only one suffering. Catherine, her mother, who had once been the calm in the storm of family life, now seemed a shadow of her former self. Her eyes, once filled with dreams and purpose, now reflected nothing but worry. The house felt cold without Jack's warmth, and Catherine's work as a counselor had become a lifeline, a distraction from the unraveling world at home. But the truth was, she was just as lost as Emily. Robert, too, was struggling. The once proud lawyer, a man of facts and logic, found himself tangled in emotions and uncertainty. He tried to maintain his composure in front of his family. But every time he opened the door to his office, the weight of the legal documents, the emails from reporters, the phone calls from his clients, all of it weighed him down. And still, there was no sign of Jack. Despite the media frenzy, the Thompsons didn't give up on their dog. Robert, never one to back down from a fight, threw himself into finding the truth. He began to sift through old records, digging into past dog-related incidents in the area, hoping to find something that could help. But as the weeks passed, the search for Jack became less about rescuing him and more about rescuing the family's reputation. Jack's disappearance was no longer just about the dog. It was about the collapse of everything they had built, their community, their family, their future. The media's portrayal of Jack as a dangerous animal had caused a ripple effect in Maple Creek. Businesses distanced themselves, no longer willing to stand by the dog who had once been welcomed with open arms. But Robert refused to accept defeat. His legal mind began to piece together inconsistencies in the case. The local authorities were dismissing evidence that didn't fit their narrative. They had written Jack off as a threat long before they even knew the truth. He knew he had to fight back, not just for Jack, but for his family. At night, when the house grew quiet and Emily was tucked into bed, Robert sat in front of his computer, poring over every detail of the case. He started to uncover patterns, inconsistencies in the reports that suggested something wasn't right. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge, and with it, the hope that they could find Jack, if only they could get the authorities to listen. Emily, meanwhile, had started her own investigation. Every night, after her mother thought she was asleep, Emily would take her phone out of the drawer, quietly researching everything she could about German Shepherds, about missing pets, about rescues. She had started a blog called Jack's Journey, where she documented everything she learned. People started reading her posts, people who believed Jack was innocent, who supported the Thompsons. Through the blog, Emily connected with other pet owners who had faced similar battles. She discovered that the truth about dogs like Jack was often twisted by people with their own agendas. The more she learned, the more she understood that Jack wasn't the villain. He was a hero, a dog who had saved lives, who had been there for everyone, but now had become the scapegoat for the community's fear. But the truth was hard to uncover. It was buried beneath layers of misinformation and prejudice. Despite Emily's growing resolve, the weight of everything she carried, the fear of losing Jack forever, the betrayal of her own community, began to take its toll. The pressure to move on from her parents, to let go of the hope that Jack would ever come back, was overwhelming. She spent her days lost in her thoughts, replaying every moment with Jack over and over in her mind, wondering if she would ever see him again. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Emily's determination didn't falter. She knew Jack was out there, somewhere. He had to be, and no matter what the world said, she would never stop searching for him. The search for Jack had become a battle of wits, a fight not just for a dog's freedom, but for the truth to rise above the noise of a misinformed and fearful world. While the rest of Maple Creek had moved on, convinced by the media frenzy and public pressure, the Thompsons and their few loyal allies refused to let go. Emily, still clutching hope with every ounce of her being, spent every waking moment piecing together clues, connecting dots that the authorities had missed, and turning her grief into action. Robert, too, dove deeper into his investigation, using his legal expertise to expose the gaps in the case. But it was becoming increasingly clear that there were forces at play far larger than he had anticipated, forces that didn't want the truth to be known. As the months passed, the emotional toll on the Thompson family continued to mount. Catherine's return to Maple Creek hadn't mended the cracks in their marriage. She had hoped that distance from the constant pressure of the media would help heal their wounds, but it only magnified the rift between her and Robert. They had become strangers to each other, speaking more out of necessity than love. Every argument felt like a betrayal, and every silence screamed louder than words. Emily, caught in the middle of the tension, had started to retreat even further. She kept a low profile at school, her grades slipping as the weight of the world bore down on her. But the dark days of isolation also fueled something in her. She wasn't just fighting for Jack anymore. She was fighting for her family, for the future they could have if they just got through this nightmare. One morning, as Emily was scrolling through the online forums for clues, she stumbled across something that made her heart skip a beat. A local animal rights activist, Rachel Morgan, had launched a campaign to find Jack. The hashtag #FindJackThompson was slowly picking up steam. It wasn't much, but it was something. Someone was out there who still believed in Jack's innocence. The momentum began to build, and soon Emily found herself in touch with Rachel, who offered her resources and connections to keep the search alive. At the same time, Robert's investigation had led him to an uncomfortable conclusion. His search for inconsistencies in the official records had turned up something unexpected. A series of doctored reports from the night Jack had rescued Tommy. The time-stamped security footage from nearby businesses, which had originally been declared unavailable due to malfunctions, had been deliberately altered. But who was behind the cover-up? The deeper Robert dug, the more he began to understand that this wasn't just a case of a dog being falsely accused. It was a political power play. Sarah Williams, the city councilwoman, had been manipulating the narrative from the start, using her influence to push through legislation that would restrict certain breeds of dogs. She was a woman driven by fear and old wounds, and Jack had become the perfect pawn in her larger game. But Robert wasn't about to let that stop him. Armed with new evidence, he hired a private investigator, Detective Michael Roberts, who specialized in cold cases and had a particular talent for finding overlooked details. Michael's first move was to dig into the records from the night of the storm. What they found was staggering. Eyewitness testimony from the paramedics who had been at the scene, statements that had never made it into the official report. According to their notes, Tommy had been playing near the creek long before Jack had appeared, and the child's injuries were consistent with water rescue protocols, not an attack. With this new evidence, Robert was ready to confront the authorities. But they weren't going to make it easy. As Robert continued to press, he discovered that his legal reputation, once unassailable, was now under attack. His clients were pulling back, avoiding the media circus that had followed him and his family. His law practice, once thriving, had become a shell of what it had been. Emily, now in constant contact with Rachel Morgan and the small group of supporters who had rallied around her cause, began to feel the stirrings of hope. If the community could see Jack for what he truly was, a hero, then maybe the tide would turn. Her research led her to something that she had missed before. There were reports of Jack being spotted around the outskirts of town, reports from people who didn't know him, who had no reason to defend him. A local farmer, Carl Davidson, had seen a large German shepherd helping stray animals and guiding them to safety during storms. Another report came from a shelter worker in Henderson County who had witnessed Jack lead an injured beagle to the front door of their shelter. With this new information, Emily reached out to Carl, hoping he could offer more answers. To her surprise, Carl had been quietly helping Jack since the stormy night he had disappeared. The farmer had witnessed Jack's acts of kindness firsthand, and he had been discreetly providing the dog with food and shelter, respecting Jack's need to remain hidden while continuing his work of service. It was Carl who revealed the most shocking information of all. Jack had been keeping an eye on his family from a distance. During the times when the Thompson house had been under attack, Jack had been lurking just outside, watching over them as only he knew how. He had never abandoned them. He was simply waiting for the right moment to return. When Emily learned this, it felt like a weight had been lifted from her chest. Jack hadn't run away. He had stayed. He had never given up on them. And now, with the truth starting to spread, the momentum was finally building. The community was waking up to the reality that Jack was not the villain in this story. He was the hero. Robert's legal battles were far from over, but for the first time in months, he felt like they were finally fighting on the right side, armed with new allies, fresh evidence, and the unwavering belief that Jack's innocence would prevail. The Thompsons set their sights on one goal, to bring Jack home. But even as the truth began to surface, they knew the hardest part was still ahead. The community that had turned on them would not easily forgive, and the scars from the past months would take time to heal. But one thing was certain, they would never give up on Jack. Not now. Not ever. The battle for Jack's truth was not one of simple victories, but a slow, painstaking process. Each day, Emily would rise before the sun, armed with her journal and laptop, poring over every detail she could find about Jack's history, about German shepherds, about missing pets and miraculous returns. Her heart ached as she reviewed the photos of Jack, his smiling face, his eyes full of intelligence and loyalty. But as she scrolled through the pages of their memories, she also felt a surge of determination. She was fighting not just for Jack, but for herself, for her family, and for everything they had lost. Robert, too, had begun to see a shift. The mounting pressure from the community and media had started to take a toll on his career. Long-term clients were withdrawing, and his legal practice, once thriving, was crumbling under the weight of a public scandal. But he couldn't stop fighting. The search for Jack had become his singular focus, and with the new evidence they had uncovered, Robert knew they were closer than ever to proving Jack's innocence. The community had been fed lies for too long, and now it was time to expose the truth. But the journey to vindication was far from simple. There were people in the town, including Sarah Williams and her coalition of supporters, who had built their reputations on Jack's guilt. They would do everything in their power to maintain the narrative that Jack was dangerous, that he didn't belong in Maple Creek. The deeper Robert dug, the more it became clear that there were forces behind the scenes, pulling strings and manipulating the truth. It wasn't just about a dog, it was about a political agenda. As the weeks passed, the Thompsons received an unexpected ally in their quest for justice, Dr. Rachel Cooper, a veterinarian who had known Jack since he was a puppy. Dr. Cooper had always admired Jack's gentle nature and impeccable training, and she was unwilling to let the lies stand. She came forward with a sworn statement, offering her professional testimony about Jack's history of service and behavior. Her words were a breath of fresh air, a light in the darkness that had surrounded the Thompsons for so long. But the tides of public opinion were slow to change. The more the Thompsons fought to clear Jack's name, the more they realized that the media's narrative was powerful, far-reaching, and difficult to undo. The news stations, once quick to condemn Jack, were now scrambling to cover their tracks. The shift in public opinion came slowly, but it was undeniable. Emily's voice, quiet but determined, had started to rise above the noise, offering a perspective that the media had missed. Jack was a hero. He was not a threat. He was the dog who had saved a child, who had served his community, who had loved his family unconditionally. In the midst of the battle, Emily learned of a breakthrough. Carl Davidson, the local farmer who had been quietly helping Jack during his time away from home, had documented Jack's activities over the months. Carl had kept a journal, detailing every sighting of Jack, every rescue he had assisted with, and every act of kindness the dog had shown. Jack had helped strays, guided injured animals to safety, and even assisted in rescue operations during storms. His actions were not just those of a lost dog trying to survive, they were the actions of a hero. Carl's journal was a key piece of evidence, and Emily wasted no time in reaching out to him. When she arrived at his farm, Carl greeted her with a warm smile, but there was a sadness in his eyes, as if he had known this day would come, but dreaded it nonetheless. "I've been waiting for you, Emily," Carl said, leading her to a small wooden desk where his journal lay open. "I knew Jack was special. He was always more than just a dog." The journal chronicled Jack's every move since the night of the storm. There were detailed accounts of Jack's protective nature, his understanding of his family's needs, and his uncanny ability to help others. But perhaps the most important part of the journal was Carl's final entry. It read, "Jack isn't lost. He's been watching over his family, even now. He's waiting for the right moment to come home." As Emily read those words, a mix of emotions flooded her heart. She felt relief, knowing that Jack had never abandoned them, but she also felt a deep sadness. The world had turned on Jack, and in doing so, it had torn apart her family. But now, with the journal in hand and the truth beginning to unfold, Emily knew that it wasn't too late to fix what had been broken. With Carl's testimony and Dr. Cooper's statement, Robert was able to build a case that the community could no longer ignore. The evidence pointed to the fact that Jack's actions on the night of Tommy's rescue were consistent with trained rescue behavior, not aggression. The truth was clear. Jack had saved a life. The accusations against him were unfounded, and it was time for the town of Maple Creek to realize it. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when a security camera footage expert, David Martinez, came forward. David had been working to restore footage from cameras near the creek and had uncovered a crucial piece of evidence. A video that clearly showed Tommy near the creek before Jack even arrived, playing alone. The video also captured Jack's precise, calculated approach as he rescued Tommy, navigating the water with the skill of a trained rescuer. The footage was irrefutable. When the video was released, it was like a bombshell. The community, once so quick to turn against Jack, was now faced with undeniable proof that he was a hero. The public outcry was immediate, but this time it wasn't against Jack. It was against the lies that had been told about him. As the truth spread, the Thompsons found themselves at the center of a movement for justice. It wasn't just about Jack anymore. It was about the power of truth and the resilience of a family that refused to be broken. The Thompsons had weathered the storm, and now they were finally beginning to heal. But the road to redemption wasn't easy. Even as the community started to rally behind Jack's name, there were still those who clung to their prejudices, who refused to acknowledge the facts. Sarah Williams, now under intense scrutiny, doubled down on her stance. She continued to advocate for breed-specific legislation, but now her support was dwindling. The truth had a way of catching up with even the most powerful of lies. For the Thompsons, though, there was a sense of closure beginning to form. They knew that bringing Jack home wasn't just about the dog. It was about healing the rifts in their family, about rebuilding the trust they had lost. They had learned that even in the darkest of times, love and truth could still shine through. Emily, standing at the front porch of their home one cold autumn morning, knew that the day was coming when Jack would return. And when he did, their family would finally be whole again. The morning air was crisp, tinged with the scent of autumn leaves and the anticipation of something long awaited. The storm had passed, but the emotional clouds still hung low over Maple Creek. Emily stood at the front porch, staring out at the quiet street, her heart a mix of hope and uncertainty. She had fought so hard for this moment, for Jack, for her family, for herself, and yet the silence felt deafening. The town had been through so much: lies, accusations, betrayals, and now the truth was out. The media had shifted, the public opinion had changed, and the community was starting to acknowledge Jack's heroism. But as the days went on, the Thompsons found themselves navigating new challenges. Healing, it seemed, was never as simple as the truth coming to light. Despite the growing support from the community, there were still whispers in the corners of Maple Creek. The scars left by Sarah Williams' campaign ran deep, and while some had begun to come around, others remained entrenched in their fear and prejudice. The town's divisions were far from healed, and the Thompsons knew that even with the truth, it would take time for the wounds to close. But there was a shift in the air that day, an undeniable sense that something was about to change. The local shelter had received a tip about a German Shepherd seen roaming near the outskirts of town, a large black and tan dog with unmistakable markings. Emily's heart skipped a beat when she heard the news. She had to see for herself. With her parents by her side and the search parties now working together, Emily found herself retracing Jack's footsteps back to the woods, to the places he had once wandered, back to the places that had once been home. They drove for hours, through the rain and the muddy roads, until they reached the edge of the woods where the tip had originated. The sight of a familiar, but much different, landscape made Emily's chest tighten. The place was quiet, eerily quiet, but it felt like a beacon of hope, like Jack had left a trail for them to follow. Then, out of the mist, he appeared. Jack! It wasn't a moment of fanfare or dramatic reunions. Instead, it was as if Jack had known exactly when to come back. He walked toward them with steady, purposeful strides, his dark eyes locked onto Emily's, as if confirming everything they had believed. He was home. In that moment, the weight of the past months, the heartbreak, the confusion, all of it seemed to dissolve. Jack, with his powerful presence, was standing in front of her, just as he had always been, the protector, the companion. the loyal friend who never truly left. Emily stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. She had practiced this moment in her mind countless times, imagining how it would feel when Jack finally came home. But this was something different. The bond they shared, forged in the darkest of times, had only grown stronger with every day apart. With a gentle but determined movement, Emily reached out her hand, just as she had done in the past. Jack, true to form, approached her slowly, his steps measured, as if testing the waters before finally allowing himself to believe it was real. When Jack's nose brushed against her palm, the floodgates opened. The emotions that had been held back for so long, grief, guilt, hope, relief, poured out in a wave of tears. Emily crouched down, her arms wrapping around Jack's neck as she buried her face in his fur. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. The reunion was tender, quiet, and profound. But it wasn't just Jack returning. It was the healing of a family, a community, and a journey that had taken them through the hardest of times. As the day unfolded, the Thompson family found themselves surrounded by a group of neighbors, supporters, and those who had once turned away from them. People who had seen Jack as a threat now looked at him with awe, realizing the truth they had been too blind to see. Jack had never been the enemy. He had been a hero all along. The emotional weight of the past few months began to lift, replaced by the dawning realization that the Thompson family could rebuild. With Jack by their side, they knew they could face whatever came next. They would heal, not just as a family, but as a community. But the journey wasn't over. The story of Jack's return wasn't just about a dog coming home. It was about redemption, about learning from the mistakes of the past, and about finding a way to live in truth and love despite the obstacles. The Thompsons knew that they still had work to do. They had to rebuild their trust, heal the wounds caused by fear and prejudice, and learn to live in the light of their shared experiences. The community's healing would take time, but with Jack's return, they had seen a glimpse of what was possible, of what could happen when love, loyalty, and truth prevailed over fear and division. The town of Maple Creek would never be the same, but perhaps, in time, that wasn't such a bad thing. With Jack's presence, there was hope for something better, something more united, more compassionate, and more just. As we reflect on the story of Jack's journey, we're reminded of the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for the truth, and the healing that comes when we choose love and loyalty over fear. Like Emily, we all face challenges that test our strength, but in the end, it's our faith, our courage, and our determination that lead us to victory. What lessons have you learned from Jack's story? How do you handle moments of hardship and adversity in your life? Share your thoughts below, and if you're moved by Jack's incredible journey, don't forget to subscribe to the Heart Force channel for more inspiring dog stories. The wind whipped fiercely through the empty streets of Willow Creek, Tennessee, as the storm clouds began to roll in. The small town, usually peaceful and serene, was bracing itself for a hurricane that was making its way across the state. People had been warned to stay indoors, secure their homes, and prepare for the worst. But for Lucas Walker, a retired paramedic, the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm he had been battling inside for years. Lucas hadn't been the same since the accident. His life had changed in an instant. A tragic crash that left him with a broken body and a fractured soul. But the pain was only the beginning. The weight of loss, the loss of a wife he had loved deeply, and a constant reminder of the tragic accident that had taken her from him, were far heavier than any physical injury. He had isolated himself from everyone. Even his old friends couldn't reach him, and his family had grown distant. His only companion was his German shepherd. Max had been with him through it all. He was more than just a dog. He was a lifeline, a reminder that there was still something worth living for. Max had been trained as a service dog, but the bond they shared went far beyond simple companionship. Max had become the heart and soul of Lucas's world, filling the emptiness left behind after the tragedy. Welcome to the Heart Force channel. We're you, and I find more meaning in life through dog stories. Before we continue, please comment below and let us know where you are listening to this video. And if you have any dog stories of your own, feel free to share them with everyone. The storm's winds howled louder as the first raindrops began to fall, but Lucas hardly noticed. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, reflecting on the past. Max sat beside him, his large brown eyes watching him closely, as if understanding the pain his owner was feeling. It was as if the dog was waiting for Lucas to reach out, to find the strength to pull himself out of the dark hole he had been living in. As the storm began to intensify, Lucas stood up and walked to the door. Max's ears perked up, sensing the change in Lucas's movements. He padded softly to the door and sat down, his gaze never leaving Lucas. The dog's presence was constant, unwavering, and it was in this quiet moment that Lucas realized just how much he depended on Max. Not just as a dog, but as a friend. "Let's go for a walk, buddy," Lucas muttered, his voice hoarse. It had been a long time since they had taken a walk together, just the two of them. He needed to clear his head. Maybe, just maybe, walking through the storm would help him feel like he was still in control, that there was still something he could do, something he could change. Max wagged his tail once, then stood, ready to go. Lucas opened the door, and they stepped into the wind and rain. The storm was relentless, but Lucas didn't care. The sound of the wind in his ears, the feel of the rain against his face, and the presence of Max beside him felt like the world was coming alive again. For the first time in a long time, Lucas felt a flicker of hope. As they walked through the town, the streets were eerily quiet, the storm keeping most people indoors. Lucas and Max made their way down the familiar paths they had walked countless times before. It was during this walk, in the midst of the storm, that something unexpected happened. Max's ears perked up suddenly, and he stopped in his tracks, his body tensed and his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Lucas turned to follow his gaze, but all he could see were the storm clouds, the rain, and the empty streets. Max began to growl low in his throat, his body stiff with alertness. "What is it, Max?" Lucas asked, his voice shaky. He had been through many storms, but this felt different. Something was wrong. Max didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes locked on something ahead, a warning in his stance. Lucas could feel his heart racing. He trusted Max with his life, and when Max acted like this, it meant something wasn't right. But Lucas couldn't see what had caught the dog's attention. He stood frozen, waiting for an answer. Suddenly, a faint cry echoed through the wind. It was distant at first, barely audible over the howling of the storm. But as the seconds ticked by, the cry became clearer, more desperate. It was the sound of a child. Max's body jolted forward, pulling Lucas toward the source of the sound. Lucas hesitated for a moment, unsure of what was happening, but Max was already on the move, guiding him through the storm. With each step, the cry grew louder, and Lucas's anxiety spiked. Who could be out here in the middle of the storm? And why hadn't anyone else heard it? Max's ears were pinned forward, and his pace quickened. Lucas had no choice but to follow. As they approached a small wooded area near the edge of town, Lucas could just make out the silhouette of a small figure huddled beneath a tree. A child, no older than 7 or 8, drenched and shivering, was crying for help. Without a second thought, Lucas rushed forward, his heart pounding. Max had already reached the child and was gently nudging him with his nose, trying to comfort the frightened boy. Lucas knelt beside him, wrapping his arm around the child's trembling shoulders. "Hey, it's okay," Lucas said softly, his voice filled with warmth and reassurance. "You're safe now." The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide with fear. But his tears slowed as he saw Lucas's calm demeanor and Max's gentle presence. Max, sensing the boy's distress, lowered his head and gently licked the child's face, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. "Max, good boy," Lucas whispered, his eyes full of gratitude for his loyal companion. In that moment, Lucas realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. He had Max, and together, they could face any storm, no matter how fierce. Lucas cradled the child in his arms. gently pulling him from under the tree where he had been sheltering from the rain. The wind howled louder now, as if the storm itself was angry, furious that it couldn't stop the bond that was forming in this strange, chaotic moment. The boy's skin was cold and clammy, his body trembling against Lucas's chest. Max, ever the loyal protector, stayed by the child's side, offering warmth and comfort as a strong body pressed against the boy's legs. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This storm wasn't just about the weather. It was a storm of fate, of destiny, of things yet to be understood. How had this boy ended up in the woods, all alone, in the middle of a hurricane? "Hey there," Lucas whispered, trying to soothe the child. "What's your name, little one?" The boy didn't answer at first, still shaking in fear. He clung to Lucas's jacket, his tiny hands gripping the fabric tightly. Lucas felt a pang of sadness. The boy had likely been through something terrifying, something that had pushed him out into the storm, alone, vulnerable. "Hey, it's all right. You're safe now," Lucas reassured him. But the boy said nothing, staring ahead with wide, fearful eyes. His lips quivered, as though the words he needed to say were trapped in his throat. Max gave a soft whine and nudged the boy's hand, urging him to pet him. The boy's hand trembled, but eventually stroked Max's thick fur. The moment was small, but it meant everything. Slowly, the tension in the boy's shoulders seemed to ease. Lucas stood up with the boy still in his arms, cradling him gently but firmly, as if he could protect the child from the entire world. The storm continued to rage, but Lucas's focus remained entirely on the child in his arms and the dog by his side. "What's your name?" Lucas asked again, a little more insistently this time, as he began walking back toward the town. The boy sniffled, his head leaning into Lucas's chest for comfort. After a long pause, he whispered, "Timmy, Timmy," Lucas repeated softly, his voice filled with empathy. He couldn't help but think of the storm in his own heart, the loss of his wife, the life he could never get back. But this was different. This wasn't about him. This child needed him now. He had to be strong for Timmy, just as Max had been strong for him. Max, sensing their purpose, guided Lucas forward, his tail tucked low, but his steps sure. The storm wasn't going to stop Max from doing what he did best, protecting, guiding, and offering the comfort that only a dog could. As they walked, the wind howled in their ears, the rain stung against their skin, but the path ahead was lit with a different kind of light. A light of possibility, of hope, of redemption. They finally reached Lucas's small cabin on the outskirts of town, the warm glow of the lights flickering through the windows. Lucas felt a sense of relief. Timmy was safe, and they were finally away from the storm. But something told him this wasn't just about the weather. It was about something bigger, something the universe had thrown in his path to remind him that, despite the pain, there was still good in the world. Max led the way up the porch steps, his head held high, as though he understood the importance of the moment. Lucas followed, carrying Timmy inside. The dog had always been a symbol of courage to him, but now, in this moment, he saw Max as more than a companion. He was a hero, a symbol of hope in the darkest of times. Once inside, Lucas settled Timmy on the couch, wrapping a blanket around his tiny shoulders. The boy was exhausted, his eyes fluttering closed, but he managed a weak smile before falling into a peaceful sleep. Lucas sat beside him, watching the child sleep, but his mind kept drifting back to the past. For so long, he had allowed his grief to consume him, isolating himself from the world. But now, for the first time in years, he felt a spark of something else. A purpose, something to hold on to, as the rain continued to lash against the windows. Lucas found himself staring at the fire in the hearth, his thoughts racing. He had once been a paramedic, a protector of life. Now he was a man who had lost everything, and yet here was a child. No, a gift placed right in his path. Timmy had come to him in his time of need, and for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt something resembling peace. Max, noticing his owner's deep thought, came over and sat beside him, nudging his hand with his cold nose. Lucas smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. "You've saved me more times than I can count, haven't you, boy?" Lucas murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Max gave a quiet, satisfied growl, as if to say, "Of course I have." And in that moment, Lucas knew that the storm outside wasn't just about the wind and rain. It was about the winds of change, of healing, and of the beginning of a new chapter in his life. The rain had not stopped when Lucas woke the next morning. It poured relentlessly, but the storm had begun to calm. Willow Creek was shrouded in mist, the streets wet and empty as the town settled into a peaceful quiet that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the night before. But for Lucas, the quiet felt different now. It felt like a beginning. Timmy was still asleep on the couch, wrapped tightly in a blanket, the soft rise and fall of his chest steady and peaceful. Lucas sat across from him, watching the boy as he slept, wondering where he had come from and why he had ended up alone in the woods in the middle of a storm. But Max, ever the vigilant companion, was awake and alert, watching Lucas carefully. The dog had not strayed far from Timmy's side all night, making sure the boy felt safe in his new surroundings. Max had taken his place as protector, just as he had done for Lucas countless times before. Lucas ran a hand through his hair and stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. His body ached, but the soreness felt familiar now. It was a reminder that he was alive and that he still had a purpose, something he hadn't truly felt for a long time. "Max," Lucas said softly, nodding toward the door. "We need to get some answers. Timmy didn't just show up here for no reason." Max's ears perked up at the sound of his name. The dog tilted his head as though he understood, then gave a short bark, ready to follow his owner anywhere. They were a team, after all. No question was too big, no storm too fierce when they worked together. Lucas walked to the door, the familiar creak of the wood reminding him of the years he had spent in this small cabin. Years filled with solitude and regret. But now, the air felt different. Timmy's presence in his home felt like an invitation to something more, something bigger than himself. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside, Max at his side. The streets of Willow Creek were quiet, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Even in the aftermath of the storm, the town had a certain energy about it. People were emerging from their homes, checking on their neighbors, and slowly beginning to rebuild their lives. But Lucas's mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were with Timmy, and the mysterious circumstances that had led him to his doorstep. He had been so absorbed in his own pain for so long that he had missed something important. Something had brought Timmy here, and Lucas needed to figure out what. "Let's head to town, boy," Lucas said, his voice firm with purpose. Max responded immediately, his tail wagging with enthusiasm, ready to face whatever came next. The town was small, and Lucas had lived here long enough to know everyone's story. He stopped by the local diner, where he knew Betty, the waitress, would be holding down the fort. She was a local fixture, always ready with a warm smile and a cup of coffee for anyone who needed it. Betty had seen it all: grief, joy, heartache, and the daily rhythms of life in a small town. If anyone knew something about Timmy, it would be her. Betty greeted him with a smile as he walked through the door. "Well, if it isn't Lucas Walker. How you holding up, hon?" she asked, her voice warm, as always. "Better now, Betty," Lucas replied, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Actually, I'm here to ask you about something. Have you seen a boy around here? About 7 or 8 years old, soaking wet, looking like he's been through a storm?" Betty's smile faded slightly, and she leaned in, lowering her voice. "I've heard whispers, but I haven't seen him. Some folks say they heard a child's cries during the storm, but no one knows where he came from. People thought it might just be the wind, you know." "Couldn't have been the wind," Lucas said, his tone serious. "I found him last night, out in the woods, alone, in the middle of the storm." Betty's eyes widened. "Out in the woods? That's dangerous. He could have been. Who knows what could have happened to him out there?" "Exactly," Lucas said. "I've got him back in my cabin, but I don't know where he came from. His parents, nothing. I need to find out who he is, Betty. He was too far out there to be just lost. There's something more to this." Betty sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I'll ask around, see if anyone knows anything. But you know how it is in small towns. People keep their secrets close." Lucas nodded, knowing that the truth often hid behind layers of small-town gossip and half-truths. But he was determined to find the boy's story, to uncover the mystery that had brought Timmy into his life. He owed it to the child, and to himself. As they left the diner, Lucas could feel a shift in the air. Something was about to change. The storm had passed, but in its wake, something deeper had been awakened. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew that Max would be by his side, leading the way, just as he always had. Max looked up at Lucas, his tail wagging gently. Lucas couldn't help but smile. The dog had always known when it was time to move forward. And now, with Timmy's presence in their lives, it was clear that the road ahead wasn't just about healing. It was about purpose. The storm had come, and it had brought change. But it had also brought something even more important, the chance for redemption. The town of Willow Creek was still wet from the storm, the streets slick with rainwater, as Lucas and Max made their way back to the cabin. The air was thick with the remnants of the hurricane, but the sky had begun to clear, offering a faint glimmer of sunlight. The storm had torn through the town, but the aftermath, for some, was just the beginning of a new reality. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the cusp of something monumental, something that had been set into motion long before he had even realized it. Timmy's appearance in his life wasn't just a coincidence. No, this was more than fate. It was the universe or God, or whatever higher power there was, nudging him in a direction he hadn't been willing to go before. As they reached the cabin, Lucas opened the door slowly, his mind still racing. Max stepped inside first, his usual calm demeanor never wavering. Timmy was still asleep on the couch, curled up in the blanket Lucas had draped over him. The boy looked peaceful now, but the storm he had been through wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Lucas knew there were questions to be answered, and not just about how Timmy had ended up alone in the woods, but about what had brought him there in the first place. Max padded over to the boy's side and lay down beside him, his head resting gently on the edge of the couch. The dog's presence was soothing, a reminder that no matter how overwhelming life became, there was always a sense of peace to be found in the love of a loyal companion. Lucas walked to the kitchen, his mind still churning. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to start. He had been so focused on his own grief, his own loss, that he had never considered that there might be someone else out there suffering just as much, someone who needed help, someone who had been calling out in the storm. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the warm liquid a small comfort, and leaned against the counter, his eyes on the empty streets outside. There had to be more to this story, more to Timmy's presence here than just a child lost in the storm. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Max raised his head, ears pricked, and Lucas's heart skipped a beat. Who could be out here now? He had already spoken to Betty at the diner, and no one else knew about Timmy, at least not yet. He opened the door cautiously, and standing on the porch was Sheriff Cole Turner, a grizzled veteran of the Willow Creek Police Department. His face was grim, and his eyes held a flicker of something Lucas couldn't quite place. "Lucas," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "Can I come in?" "Of course," Lucas replied, stepping aside to let the sheriff in. Max, ever the protector, stood up immediately and gave a low growl. But Cole was no stranger to him, so the dog quickly calmed down. Cole sat down at the kitchen table, his face hard and serious. "I've been hearing some things around town," he began, his voice low. "Strange things. People say they've seen a boy around here, a boy no one can identify, and that he's been calling out for help in the storm." Lucas's heart sank. "That's him. Timmy. I found him last night. He was out in the woods, all alone." Sheriff Turner's eyes narrowed. "I've been following up on some leads. Some folks claimed they saw a man with a boy earlier that day, just before the storm hit. But no one can give me a clear description. All I know is that something isn't right about this. The boy's story, it doesn't add up. Where did they see him?" Lucas asked, leaning forward, his curiosity piqued. "They were spotted near the old mill on the edge of town," Cole replied. "But when I checked it out, there was no sign of anyone. Just some footprints in the mud. And then Timmy shows up on your doorstep, soaked to the bone." Lucas rubbed his chin, his mind whirring. The old mill was a place many people avoided, a relic from a bygone era. It had been abandoned for years, a crumbling shell of what it used to be. but it was also known for being a place where strange things happened, a place where secrets were buried, both figuratively and literally. "This doesn't feel right, Sheriff," Lucas said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "I'm telling you, there's something more to this. I can feel it." Cole stood up, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. "I don't doubt you, Lucas, but we need to be careful. This town's been through enough already. If there's something going on here, we need to handle it carefully." Max stood at attention, sensing the shift in Lucas's mood. He walked over to the sheriff and sniffed his boots, as if assessing the situation. It was as though the dog understood that something deeper was at play, something beyond their immediate control. "I agree," Lucas said, his tone now resolute. "But whatever is happening, we need to get to the bottom of it. For Timmy's sake, and for ours." The sheriff nodded, his face hardening. "I'll check the mill again. You stay here with the boy. Keep him safe." Lucas nodded, and as Cole left the cabin, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the puzzle was far from complete. There was something dark at the heart of this, and Timmy was at the center of it. Max padded over to Lucas, sitting at his feet, looking up at him with those wise eyes. It was as though the dog was silently telling him that they weren't alone in this. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The storm had passed, but the real battle was just beginning. The day stretched on as Lucas and Max waited in silence. The quiet hum of the house seemed like a stark contrast to the storm outside and the whirlwind of questions that swirled in Lucas's mind. What was it about Timmy that made him so important? How had the boy ended up on his doorstep, alone in the middle of the storm? And why had the sheriff seemed so uneasy when he mentioned the old mill? Lucas walked over to the window, peering through the raindrops that still clung to the glass. The town of Willow Creek had returned to its usual calm, but underneath the peaceful facade, Lucas felt a sense of foreboding that gnawed at him. Max, ever the perceptive dog, stood beside him, his head tilted slightly as if sensing his owner's unrest. The minutes seemed to drag on, and just as Lucas was about to pour another cup of coffee, the door opened. Sheriff Turner stood in the doorway, his face grim and dusted with the remains of the mill's decay. Behind him, Timmy's eyes widened in recognition at the sheriff's appearance, but the boy remained silent, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Lucas," Cole said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "We need to talk. There's more to this than we thought." Lucas stepped aside, letting the sheriff in. Max didn't move, but his ears were alert, his tail still as he watched the sheriff closely. "What happened?" Lucas asked, his voice taut with anticipation. The sheriff sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I went to the old mill like I said I would, and what I found wasn't something I was expecting." Lucas's heart raced as he waited for the sheriff to continue. He felt Max nudge his leg, a silent reminder that they had come this far, and they were in this together. "I found traces of recent activity," Cole said, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "Someone had been living there, hidden in the shadows. It's not a place people frequent, but there were signs of life. Someone had made camp." "Was it the boy's father?" Lucas asked, the question hanging in the air, heavy with uncertainty. Cole shook his head slowly. It wasn't just a man. It was something else entirely. He paused, looking over at Timmy, who sat quietly, his gaze avoiding the sheriff. "Lucas, I think the boy's been running from something much worse than just the storm." A chill ran down Lucas's spine. The sheriff's words echoed in the silence of the room, and Max's growl grew low, a rumble deep in his chest. There was a shift in the air. Something wasn't right. Cole's expression softened. "I don't know how to say this, but there's a connection between Timmy and the mill. Not just because he was found there, but because of the things I found when I searched. It's as if someone or something has been hiding him and keeping him away from the truth." Lucas's brow furrowed. "What truth?" The sheriff's eyes met Lucas's with a mixture of compassion and regret. "There are rumors in town about a local organization, a group that's been operating in secret for years. It's been hush-hush for a long time, but I've been getting more whispers lately. There's been talk of illegal activities, shady dealings that stretch back decades. And I think Timmy's caught in the middle of it. His father isn't just a man trying to protect him. He's part of something much darker. Lucas's mind was reeling, the puzzle pieces scattering in every direction. But one thing was clear now. Timmy wasn't just a lost child. He had been purposefully hidden, tucked away from a world that was both dangerous and deadly. And somehow, he had ended up here, in Lucas's cabin, on the night of a storm that had changed everything. Max stood suddenly, his body rigid as he stared at the boy. Lucas turned to Timmy, who was now looking up, his eyes wide and filled with a deep sadness. It was as if the weight of everything Timmy had been through was too much to bear. "I didn't want anyone to find me," Timmy whispered, his voice trembling. "They'll hurt me, and you." Max padded over to Timmy, sitting by his side, his presence comforting yet strong. Lucas's heart clenched as he knelt down beside the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now, Timmy," Lucas said gently, his voice soft but firm. "You're not alone. We'll make sure no one hurts you. Max and I will protect you, no matter what." Timmy's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry. He didn't need to. The relief in his gaze was all Lucas needed to see. The storm had brought them together, and now they were bound by something stronger than fate, a promise. Sheriff Turner stepped back, his voice low. "Lucas, I'm not sure where this will go, but I'll make sure you're safe, and I'll help you figure this out, whatever it takes." Lucas nodded, his mind racing with everything he had learned, everything he had yet to understand. Timmy's father, the organization, the mill, there were still so many pieces to this story. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He couldn't do it alone. Together, they would uncover the truth. And together, they would heal. Max's head turned toward the door as if to say, "Let's go." And Lucas, his heart full of determination, stood tall. The storm had passed, but the real fight was just beginning. Lucas and Max's journey reminds us that sometimes the storms in our lives aren't just about what we can see. They're about the hidden struggles and the strength we find when we choose to face them head-on. Timmy's appearance in their lives was no coincidence. It was a test of trust, courage, and loyalty. In the end, it's not just about surviving the storm, but about rising above it together. What are your thoughts on Lucas, Max, and Timmy's journey? Have you ever found yourself facing a storm that seemed impossible to overcome? Share your reflections in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the Heart Force channel for more inspiring stories of courage, loyalty, and healing.